He thought he'd lost it for good, but when a kid returned the wallet with a drawing inside labeled Dad and Me, he realized this wasn't just lost property. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Rain pounded against the windshield of James Harrington's Bentley as he navigated through the busy streets of downtown Manhattan. The weather matched his mood, dark, turbulent, unforgiving. It had been 5 years since the accident that took his wife Claire, and the anniversary always left him feeling hollow, a shell of the man he once was. Success, wealth, power, he had it all, yet nothing filled the void her absence had created. James pulled into his reserved parking spot at Harrington Enterprises, a 40-story monument to his success in the financial world. As CEO of one of the largest investment firms in New York, he commanded respect and wielded influence that most men could only dream of. His net worth had crossed the 9-figure mark years ago, but today, surrounded by the storm both outside and within, none of it mattered. "Good morning, Mr. Harrington," his assistant Melissa greeted as he stepped off the elevator, shaking rainwater from his custom-tailored suit. "The board meeting starts in 30 minutes. I've prepared the quarterly reports." James nodded, barely registering her words. "Coffee, black," he muttered, making his way toward his corner office. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city below, gray and shrouded in rain. He stood there for a moment, watching droplets race down the glass, remembering how Claire used to say that rainy days were just the sky's way of washing away yesterday's troubles. The day dragged on endlessly. Meetings, conference calls, decisions worth millions made with barely a second thought. By late afternoon, the storm had intensified, mirroring the turmoil in his heart. He decided to leave early, something he rarely did. The anniversary always hit him harder than he cared to admit. "Cancel my dinner with Peterson," he instructed Melissa on his way out. "Reschedule for next week." "But sir, he's flying in specifically to—" "Next week," James repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Instead of heading straight home to his empty penthouse, James found himself driving toward the small Italian restaurant in the village where he and Claire had their first date. It was a tradition of sorts, his way of honoring her memory. The tiny establishment was tucked between a bookstore and an antique shop, easily missed unless you knew it was there. He frequented it only once a year on this day. The familiar scent of garlic and fresh basil greeted him as he stepped inside, shaking off his umbrella. The owner, Marco, recognized him immediately. "Mr. Harrington," he said with a sad smile, "your usual table is ready." James nodded his thanks and followed Marco to the small table in the corner. It was here that Claire had laughed so hard, wine came out her nose during their first date. The memory, once vivid and warm, now felt like a faded photograph worn at the edges from being handled too much. "Bring me a bottle of the '82 Brunello," he said, settling into his chair. It had been Claire's favorite. As he sat alone with his memories, the restaurant slowly filled with people seeking refuge from the storm. Couples holding hands across tables, families sharing meals, friends laughing over wine, all the connections he had lost or never formed. James poured himself another glass, feeling the weight of solitude press against his chest. 2 hours and half a bottle later, he signaled for the check. The alcohol had dulled the edges of his grief, but the core remained intact, a permanent fixture in his life. He pulled out his wallet, Italian leather, handcrafted, with his initials embossed in gold, and placed his black card on the check. As he waited for Marco to return, James noticed a young woman struggling with a toddler at a nearby table. The child, a boy no older than 3, was growing restless, his cries becoming increasingly insistent. The mother, clearly exhausted, tried to soothe him while simultaneously attempting to eat her own meal, which had likely gone cold. There was something about her that struck him. Not her appearance, though she was certainly pretty with chestnut hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, but rather the determined set of her shoulders, the gentle way she spoke to her son despite her obvious fatigue. It reminded him of Claire, how she never lost her patience, even in the most trying circumstances. On impulse, James called Marco over. "Add her bill to mine," he said quietly, nodding toward the young woman's table. Marco smiled knowingly. "Very generous, Mr. Harrington. Just like old times." James felt a pang at the reference to his past self, the man he was when Claire was alive, someone who noticed others, who cared enough to help without being asked. That man had largely died with Claire, buried beneath years of solitary focus on building his empire. When Marco returned with his card, James signed the receipt, leaving a generous tip as always. He stood to leave, gathering his coat and umbrella, eager to escape the warmth of the restaurant that made his own life feel colder by comparison. Outside, the rain had eased to a gentle drizzle. James walked a few blocks, letting the cool air clear his head before heading to where he'd parked his car. As he turned the corner, a figure bumped into him, hard enough to make him stumble back a step. "Sorry, mister," a young voice mumbled as the boy, no more than 12, regained his balance and continued running down the street, disappearing around the corner. James frowned, straightening his coat. Street kids were common enough in the city, even in nicer neighborhoods. He thought nothing more of it as he reached for his wallet to check for his car keys. It was gone. The realization hit him with unexpected force. His wallet, containing his identification, credit cards, several $100s in cash, and something more precious. A small photo of Claire he kept behind his driver's license. The last photo taken of her, smiling at him from their boat on the lake, just days before the accident. "Damn it," he muttered, turning back toward the direction the boy had run. But the street was empty now, the child long gone. For a moment, James considered calling the police, but what would be the point? By the time they responded, the wallet would be emptied, the cash spent, the cards maxed out or discarded. The only thing irreplaceable was Claire's photo, and no one would value that but him. With a resigned sigh, he continued to his car. It was just a wallet after all. He could cancel the cards, replace the identification, withdraw more cash. That's what wealth afforded him, the luxury of losing things without real consequence. What he couldn't replace was that photo, that last perfect moment captured in time. As he drove home through the glistening streets of New York, James felt Claire's absence more acutely than he had in years. It wasn't just her he had lost, but pieces of himself that had scattered like ashes in the wind, never to be gathered again. Little did he know that the boy who had taken his wallet would soon return much more than what he had stolen. In the coming weeks, James Harrington would receive something he never expected, something that would change the course of his carefully ordered life forever. 2 weeks passed since James lost his wallet. He'd gone through the motions of canceling credit cards, ordering new identification, and tried to forget about the irreplaceable photo of Claire. The pain of losing that last memento had lingered longer than he expected, a fresh wound atop scars that had never fully healed. Life continued its predictable rhythm: board meetings, investment decisions, solitary dinners, empty penthouse, the mechanical existence of a man who had everything and nothing at the same time. On the other side of the city, in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in Queens, 12-year-old Ethan Matthews sat cross-legged on his bed, staring at the contents spread before him. The leather wallet lay open, its owner's face staring back from the driver's license. James Harrington. The name meant nothing to Ethan when he first took the wallet, but a quick internet search had revealed the truth. This man wasn't just rich, he was mega rich. CEO of Harrington Enterprises, net worth in the hundreds of millions. The kind of man whose photo appeared in business magazines and on financial news channels. Ethan hadn't meant to steal the wallet. He'd been running from some older boys who'd been hassling him, not watching where he was going, when he collided with the well-dressed man. The wallet had fallen, and in his panic, Ethan had scooped it up without thinking. It wasn't until he was safely home that he realized what he'd done. By then, it felt too late to fix his mistake, and they needed the money so badly. "Ethan," his mother's voice called from the hallway. "You doing homework?" He quickly gathered the wallet and its contents, shoving them under his pillow. "Yeah, Mom. Almost done." The door opened slightly and Sarah Matthews peeked in. Even exhausted from her double shift at the hospital where she worked as a nurse, she managed a warm smile. "Dinner's ready. Just pasta again, I'm afraid." "That's fine," Ethan said, returning her smile. "I like pasta." It was a small lie they both maintained. Of course he was tired of pasta, just as she was tired of making it. But since his father had walked out 3 years ago, leaving them with mounting debts and barely enough child support to cover rent, pasta had become a staple. Cheap, filling, and endlessly adaptable when the refrigerator offered little else. After dinner, while his mother took a much-needed shower, Ethan returned to the wallet hidden under his pillow. He'd already removed the cash, $320, the day he took it. The money had gone straight to his mother's purse while she slept, a mysterious windfall she attributed to having miscounted her tips at the diner where she worked weekends. Ethan had kept the credit cards, uncertain what to do with them. He knew using them would be a bigger crime than what he'd already committed. Besides, transactions could be traced, and the last thing they needed was the police knocking on their door. What had stopped him from discarding the wallet entirely was the photo. A woman with auburn hair and bright eyes, smiling from what looked like a boat. He'd noticed how worn the edges were, as if someone had handled it often. The way it was positioned behind the license rather than in the photo display section suggested it was special, private. There was something about her smile that reminded Ethan of his mother before everything fell apart. Before the late-night crying he pretended not to hear, before the constant worry lines had taken permanent residence on her forehead. Pulling out his school notebook, Ethan began to draw. Art had always been his escape, his one true talent. With careful strokes, he sketched the woman from the photo, capturing her joyful expression, the light in her eyes. Then beside her, he started a new figure, the man from the license, James Harrington. His expression in the ID photo was serious, almost stern, but Ethan softened it in his drawing, imagining what this man might look like if he smiled the way the woman did. As he drew, a story formed in his mind. Maybe this woman was his wife. Maybe she was gone now. Why else would he carry her photo hidden behind his license? Maybe that's why Mr. Harrington had looked so sad that night in the rain. On impulse, Ethan added 2 more figures to his drawing, smaller ones standing beside the adults. A family. The family this man might have had, or wished for, or lost. Above them, in his neatest handwriting, he wrote simply, "Dad and me." The next morning, Ethan made a decision. He packed the wallet, minus the cash he couldn't return, and his drawing into his backpack. After school, instead of heading home, he took the subway into Manhattan, following the address on James Harrington's license. The building was imposing, all glass and steel reaching toward the clouds. Ethan stood across the street, suddenly overwhelmed by doubt. What had seemed like a good idea in the safety of his bedroom now felt impossible. A kid like him would never make it past security, never get to someone like James Harrington. For nearly an hour he watched people enter and exit, trying to gather the courage to approach. Finally, just as he was about to give up, a familiar figure emerged from a black car at the curb. Even from across the street, Ethan recognized James Harrington, looking exactly as intimidating in person as he had appeared online. Tall, distinguished, with an air of authority that made others instinctively step aside. Before he could reconsider, Ethan darted across the street, dodging cars that honked angrily. "Mr. Harrington!" he called out, breathless. James turned, his expression shifting from annoyance at the interruption to confusion as he took in the young boy rushing toward him. Something about the child seemed vaguely familiar, though he couldn't place where he might have seen him before. "I'm sorry," Ethan said, coming to a stop a few feet away. His heart hammered in his chest. "I have something that belongs to you." With trembling hands, he reached into his backpack and pulled out the wallet, holding it out like an offering. "I took this from you that night in the rain. I didn't mean to steal it, we needed the money. I'm really sorry." James stared at the wallet in disbelief. After 2 weeks, it was the last thing he expected to see again. He reached out slowly, taking it from the boy's outstretched hand. "The cash is gone," Ethan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I gave it to my mom. She's been working really hard and I just wanted to help. But everything else is there." James opened the wallet, quickly finding what mattered most: Claire's photo, still tucked safely behind his license. Relief washed over him, an emotion so powerful it momentarily left him speechless. "I made you something too," Ethan continued, pulling out a folded piece of paper. "To say sorry." James unfolded the drawing, and what he saw caused his breath to catch. The woman in the boat, Claire, rendered with surprising skill and sensitivity. Beside her, a softened version of himself. And there, completing the picture, 2 children. A family that had never existed. Above them, the simple words, "Dad and me." Something shifted inside James Harrington at that moment. Something that had been frozen for 5 long years began to thaw. Looking from the drawing to the boy's anxious face, he felt an unexpected connection. To this child, to the world, to possibilities he had long since dismissed. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "Ethan. Ethan Matthews." "Well, Ethan Matthews," James said, carefully refolding the drawing. "I think you and I have some things to discuss. How about we start with lunch?" As they walked together toward a nearby cafe, James couldn't explain the strange sense of rightness he felt. All he knew was that this boy, this unexpected messenger from a universe that perhaps hadn't forgotten him after all, had returned more than just his wallet. He had returned a piece of James's humanity, long thought lost. And for the first time in 5 years, James Harrington found himself looking forward to tomorrow. The cafe was modest by James's standards, the kind of place he would typically overlook in favor of Michelin-starred restaurants where maitre d's knew him by name. But watching Ethan devour a cheeseburger with the unrestrained enthusiasm only a 12-year-old could muster, James found himself appreciating the simple setting. "So," James said, picking at his own sandwich, "tell me about yourself." Ethan swallowed a large bite, wiping his mouth with a paper napkin. "Not much to tell. I live in Queens with my mom. I'm in 7th grade at Woodside Middle. I like drawing and science." "Your artwork is impressive," James said, the folded drawing now tucked safely in his breast pocket. "How long have you been drawing?" "Always, I guess. Mom says I started before I could talk." Ethan's expression brightened. "She used to help me before she got so busy." There was a story there, James could tell, a sadness beneath the words that echoed his own. "And your father?" Ethan's eyes dropped to his plate. "He left 3 years ago, has a new family in Chicago now." The familiar narrative hit James harder than expected. Another broken home, another child left to make sense of an adult's abandonment. He had been lucky in his own childhood, loving parents, stable home, private schools, and opportunities that had set him on his path to success. But he'd seen enough of the world to know his experience was the exception, not the rule. "I'm sorry to hear that," James said, meaning it. Ethan shrugged with practiced indifference. It's okay. Mom works really hard to take care of us. She's a nurse at Queen's General and she waitresses on weekends. That can't leave much time for you. She tries, Ethan said defensively. It's not her fault. James nodded, respecting the boy's loyalty. I wasn't suggesting it was. It sounds like your mother is doing her best in a difficult situation. They ate in silence for a moment before James spoke again. You mentioned science. What areas interest you? Ethan's face lit up. Astronomy, mostly. I want to work for NASA someday. Design spacecraft or maybe be an astronaut. He hesitated, then added with a touch of embarrassment, I know it's a long shot. Why would you say that? James asked. Well, you need college for that. Probably lots of it. And he trailed off, the implication clear. College wasn't a given in Ethan's world. It was a distant dream, separated from reality by financial barriers that seemed insurmountable. James felt something stir inside him, an impulse to fix, to solve, to make right. It was the same drive that had made him successful in business, but this was different. This wasn't about profit margins or market shares. This was about a bright kid who had made a mistake, tried to make it right, and now sat across from him with dreams too easily crushed by circumstance. Education is important, James said carefully, but so is character. What you did today, returning the wallet, apologizing, that says a lot about who you are. Ethan shifted uncomfortably under the praise. I shouldn't have taken it in the first place. Perhaps, but we all make mistakes. It's what we do after that defines us. When they finished eating, James insisted on driving Ethan home. The boy protested mildly, accustomed to navigating the city on his own, but eventually relented. As they traveled from Manhattan's gleaming towers to the more modest streets of Queens, James was struck by how quickly the landscape changed, wealth and poverty existing in such close proximity, yet worlds apart. Ethan directed him to a worn apartment building, its brick facade dulled by years of exhaust from the nearby expressway. James parked his Bentley at the curb, drawing curious stares from neighbors not accustomed to such luxury in their midst. Thanks for lunch, Ethan said, reaching for the door handle, and for not calling the cops on me. James smiled. Thank you for returning my wallet, especially the photo. Ethan nodded, understanding. She's beautiful. Your wife? Yes, James said softly. She was. The boy caught the past tense, his face softening with recognition. I'm sorry. It was 5 years ago, James said, surprised by his willingness to share this with a child he'd just met. Car accident. Ethan was quiet for a moment. That's why you keep her picture hidden where only you can see it. The observation, so simple yet profound from someone so young, caught James off guard. Yes, I suppose that's exactly why. Before Ethan could exit the car, the building's front door opened and a woman emerged, clearly in a hurry. Even from a distance, James could see the resemblance to Ethan. Same dark hair, same determined set of the jaw. This had to be his mother. She spotted Ethan in the luxury car and froze, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm. In 3 quick strides, she was at the passenger door, yanking it open. Ethan, what on earth? She stopped, taking in James with undisguised suspicion. Who are you? Mom, it's okay, Ethan said quickly. This is Mr. Harrington. I had to return something to him. Sarah Matthews was not appeased. Get out of the car, Ethan, now. James stepped out of the driver's side, adjusting his suit jacket, a reflex more than a necessary action. Mrs. Matthews, I'm James Harrington. Your son was returning my wallet. He found it recently. He chose his words carefully, unwilling to expose Ethan's theft. Sarah's eyes narrowed, darting between James and her son. Found it? Yes, James confirmed smoothly. And he went to considerable trouble to return it intact. You've raised a very honest young man. Ethan looked away, his cheeks flushing with guilt that his mother couldn't see but James recognized all too well. Sarah's posture relaxed slightly, though wariness still emanated from her. "Well, I'm glad he did the right thing, but Ethan, you know better than to get into cars with strangers, no matter how well-intentioned they might be." "I insisted on driving him home," James said. "It seemed the least I could do to thank him. In fact, I'd like to express my gratitude further." He reached for his wallet, the very one Ethan had returned, and began to extract several bills. Sarah's expression hardened instantly. "That won't be necessary, Mr. Harrington. We don't need your money." The pride in her voice was unmistakable, a fierce dignity that refused to be purchased. James respected it immediately, recognizing in her the same resilience he'd glimpsed in her son. "Of course," he said, returning the wallet to his pocket. "I apologize if I offended you." An awkward silence fell between them, broken only when Ethan spoke up. "Mr. Harrington is the CEO of Harrington Enterprises, Mom. He's really important." Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly, but her expression remained neutral. "Is that so? Well, important or not, Ethan has homework to finish. Thank you for bringing him home, Mr. Harrington." James nodded, accepting the dismissal. But before he could retreat to his car, a sudden impulse seized him. "Mrs. Matthews, I wonder if I might make another suggestion. Ethan showed me some of his artwork today. He's quite talented." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "Yes, he is. I've been looking for someone to help with a project. Some concept sketches for a new building my company is developing. Perhaps Ethan might be interested. It would be paid work, of course." Both Ethan and his mother stared at James in surprise. The boy recovered first, his eyes lighting up. "Really? You'd pay me to draw?" Sarah placed a protective hand on her son's shoulder. "Mr. Harrington, while I appreciate the offer, It's legitimate work," James interjected gently. "Ethan has a unique perspective that could be valuable to my team, and it would be after school, completely flexible around his schedule and yours." He saw the conflict play across her face, suspicion warring with practical consideration of what such an opportunity might mean for her son. "Could I at least give you my card?" James asked, extending a small rectangle of heavy cardstock embossed with the Harrington Enterprises logo. "Think it over. Talk about it together." After a moment's hesitation, Sarah accepted the card. "We'll discuss it," she said, her tone making it clear that no promises were being made. "Come on, Ethan. Dinner won't make itself." As they walked away, Ethan glanced back over his shoulder, offering James a small, hopeful smile. James raised his hand in a subtle wave, watching as they disappeared into the building. Sliding back into his car, James sat motionless for several minutes. The encounter had left him feeling strangely energized, more present than he had felt in years. There was something about Ethan, his talent, his situation, the earnestness with which he had tried to make amends, that had pierced through the numbness James had wrapped around himself like armor. As he pulled away from the curb, James realized he was already thinking about what kind of project he could create to justify hiring a 12-year-old artist. It was ridiculous, of course, completely unprofessional, and likely impractical. And yet, for the first time in 5 years, James Harrington found himself genuinely caring about something beyond his own grief and the empire he had built to distract himself from it. 3 days passed without word from the Matthews family. James told himself it didn't matter. The offer had been impulsive anyway, born from an unexpected connection with a boy who had stolen and then returned his wallet. Yet he found himself checking his messages more frequently than usual, distracted during meetings, his thoughts drifting to the worn apartment building in Queens. On the 4th day, while reviewing quarterly projections with his executive team, his assistant interrupted with a note. James excused himself, stepping into the hallway to read it. A Mrs. Matthews called. She said her son is interested in the project you discussed. She left her number. James felt an unexpected surge of satisfaction. He finished the meeting on autopilot, his mind already formulating plans. As soon as the boardroom cleared, he called the number. Sarah answered on the third ring, her voice cautious but civil. "Mr. Harrington, thank you for calling back. Please call me James," he said. "I understand Ethan might be interested in doing some work for me." "He hasn't stopped talking about it," Sarah admitted, a hint of warmth breaking through her reserve. "But I need to be clear about something. If this is some kind of charity—" "It's not," James interrupted firmly. "Harrington Enterprises is developing a community center in Queens. We need concept sketches that capture a child's perspective on what makes a space welcoming. Ethan's talent is genuine, and his insight would be valuable." It wasn't entirely a fabrication. His company was indeed planning a community center, though the project was still in early stages. The need for a child artist's input was his own invention, but the more he thought about it, the more sense it made. Why shouldn't the space reflect the vision of those it aimed to serve? There was silence on the other end before Sarah spoke again. "I checked you out, online." James smiled. Of course she had. "And what did you find?" "That you're exactly who Ethan said you were, CEO of Harrington Enterprises, philanthropist, widower." She paused. "Forbes listed your net worth at $850 million last year." James winced slightly. He never liked the public calculations of his wealth. The financial press tends to exaggerate. "Does it?" Her tone was skeptical. "Look, Mr. Harrington." "James," he reminded her. "James," she conceded, "I need to understand why someone in your position would take an interest in my son. People like you don't typically hire 12-year-old boys from Queens for legitimate work." Her directness was refreshing after years of people telling him what they thought he wanted to hear. "You're right to be suspicious," he acknowledged. "But the truth is simple. Ethan showed character by returning my wallet and talent in his drawing. I'm in a position to offer him an opportunity that recognizes both, that's all." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "He would need to work after school, and it can't interfere with his homework." "Of course," James agreed quickly. 2 afternoons a week? I can send a car." "No," Sarah cut in. "No private cars. I'll drop him off on my way to work. My shift starts at 4 on Tuesdays and Thursdays." James checked his calendar mentally. "That works. Shall we say tomorrow at 4? After confirming the details, James hung up and leaned back in his chair, wondering what he had just set in motion. Then he called his project director to accelerate plans for the community center. By the time Ethan arrived, James wanted to ensure there was real work for him to do. The next afternoon, James found himself strangely nervous as he waited in the lobby of Harrington Enterprises. Employees cast curious glances his way. It was unusual for the CEO to personally greet visitors, especially in the public area, rather than the executive floor. At precisely 4 o'clock, the glass doors slid open and Ethan entered with his mother. The boy wore what appeared to be his school clothes, slightly rumpled from the day, while Sarah was dressed in scrubs, clearly headed to her nursing shift afterward. "Mr. Harrington," Sarah said formally, extending her hand, "thank you for this opportunity." James shook her hand, noting the strength in her grip. "The pleasure is mine, Mrs. Matthews." "Mom, you're going to be late," Ethan said, clearly eager for her to leave so the real work could begin. Sarah smiled, ruffling his hair affectionately. "I'll pick you up at 7, right here in the lobby. Be good." Once she had gone, James led Ethan to the elevator. "I thought we'd work in my office today. The project team is eager to see what you come up with." Ethan's eyes widened as they ascended to the top floor, the executive suite opening before them in a sweep of polished marble and glass. "This is where you work every day?" "Too much of every day," James admitted, guiding him through the maze of executive assistants and corner offices to his own spacious domain. Ethan whistled softly as they entered. "This is bigger than our whole apartment." The observation made James uncomfortable in a way he hadn't expected. He gestured toward a conference table where he had arranged sketchbooks, pencils, and digital tablets. "I wasn't sure what medium you prefer." Ethan approached the supplies with reverence. "These are professional grade," he said, picking up one of the drawing pencils. "Mom could never afford these." "They're yours to keep," James said. "Consider it part of your compensation." For the next hour, James explained the community center project, its location in Queens, not far from where Ethan lived, its purpose to provide educational resources, recreational facilities, and support services for local families. As he spoke, he watched Ethan's expression shift from polite interest to genuine excitement. "So you want me to draw what I think it should look like inside?" Ethan asked. "Exactly. If you were designing a space where you and your friends would want to spend time, what would it include? What would make it special?" Ethan needed no further prompting. He selected a sketchbook and pencil and began drawing immediately, his brow furrowed in concentration. James pretended to work at his desk, occasionally stealing glances at the boy who seemed completely lost in his creative process. After about 40 minutes, Ethan looked up. "Can I see the actual location? It might help to know exactly where it's going to be." The request caught James by surprise. "You want to visit the site?" "If that's okay. Mom always says you should understand the whole picture before you start working on the details." James checked his watch. "We have time before your mother returns. Let's go." 20 minutes later, they stood on an empty lot in Queens, the skeleton of an abandoned warehouse, the only structure on the property. Harrington Enterprises had purchased it months ago, but development had stalled due to rezoning issues. Ethan walked the perimeter slowly, studying the space from different angles. "There's good light from the east," he observed. "And it's close to the subway. That's important." James watched, impressed by the boy's methodical assessment. "What else do you notice?" "It's near 3 schools," Ethan said. "And that park over there doesn't have much, just some old swings and a basketball court with no nets." He turned to James. "You could make this place amazing." "That's the plan," James said, "with your help." On the drive back to Harrington Enterprises, Ethan was quiet, staring out the window at the neighborhood, his neighborhood, with new eyes. "Why are you really doing this?" he finally asked. The question caught James off guard. "Doing what?" "This project. Hiring me." Ethan turned to face him. "Is it because you feel sorry for me because I stole your wallet?" James considered his answer carefully. "No, it's not that. I think it's because when I saw your drawing, the one with the woman from my wallet, I realized you see things differently than most people. You see possibilities where others might not." "Like the community center," Ethan said. "Like the community center," James agreed. "And maybe other things too." When they returned to the office, Ethan worked furiously until Sarah arrived, producing 3 detailed sketches that showed remarkable insight into what might make the space functional and welcoming for people his age. As they said goodbye in the lobby, James felt a reluctance to end the session. "Same time Thursday?" he asked. Ethan nodded eagerly. "I'll have more ideas by then." "I'm counting on it," James said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. After they left, James returned to his office and studied Ethan's sketches. They were good, better than good. Behind the technical skill was an understanding of how spaces affected people, how design could foster community or inhibit it. For the first time in years, James felt a spark of genuine excitement about one of his projects. The community center had been conceived as a tax write-off, a public relations gesture. Now, through Ethan's eyes, he was beginning to see it as something more, something that might actually matter. As he placed the sketches carefully in his briefcase to take home, James realized he was looking forward to Thursday, to seeing what other insights Ethan might bring, to continuing whatever this unexpected connection was becoming. It wasn't the feeling he had expected when a young thief returned his wallet, but it was something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. Over the following weeks, a routine developed. Twice a week, Ethan would arrive at Harrington Enterprises, backpack slung over one shoulder, a folder of new ideas clutched in his hand. Each session began with James reviewing Ethan's latest sketches, asking questions that pushed the boy to think deeper about his designs, to consider angles he might have missed. Then they would work side by side, James on his laptop handling company business, Ethan at the conference table refining his concepts. Sarah initially insisted on picking Ethan up promptly at 7, often arriving in her nurse's scrubs, exhaustion evident in the slump of her shoulders. But as the weeks passed, James noticed her gradually relaxing her vigilance. She began allowing James to drive Ethan home occasionally, using the extra time to pick up an extra shift or simply rest. Small concessions that spoke volumes about her slowly growing trust. One Thursday afternoon in late October, James looked up from his computer to find Ethan staring out the window, pencil idle in his hand. "Everything all right?" James asked. Ethan shrugged without turning. "Just thinking." James saved his document and moved to sit across from the boy. "Penny, for your thoughts?" "My teacher asked us to write about what we want to be when we grow up," Ethan said, still gazing at the Manhattan skyline. Everyone else knew right away. "And you didn't?" Ethan finally turned to face him. "I used to think I wanted to be an artist or a scientist for NASA, but now I'm not sure." "Those both sound like excellent choices," James said. "Why the uncertainty?" "I've been watching you," Ethan admitted. "How you run this company, how people listen when you talk, how you're making the community center happen just because you decided it should. That's real power, isn't it? Being able to change things." James felt a strange mix of pride and discomfort at being the object of the boy's admiration. "Power isn't everything, Ethan, and it comes with tremendous responsibility." "But you use it to help people," Ethan persisted. "Mom says businesses only care about money, but you're different." James winced inwardly at the assessment. Was he different? The community center project had indeed changed since Ethan became involved. What began as a tax write-off had evolved into something James genuinely cared about. But one project didn't erase a career built on prioritizing profit above all else. "Your mother is right to be skeptical," James said carefully. "Business can bring out the worst in people, including me at times." Ethan considered this. "Is that why you started the project? To do something good for a change?" The directness of the question made James chuckle despite himself. "You don't pull punches, do you?" "Mom says I'm pathologically honest. I'm not sure what that means, but she doesn't always like it." "It means you speak the truth even when it's uncomfortable," James explained. "And no, the community center wasn't originally my idea. It was a suggestion from our public relations team, but sometimes good things can come from imperfect beginnings." Ethan seemed satisfied with this answer. He returned to his sketch, adding details to a teen lounge area he had envisioned for the center. James watched him work, struck by how the boy's presence had somehow become a natural part of his week, how he found himself looking forward to these afternoons amid the otherwise relentless pace of his corporate life. Later that evening, after dropping Ethan at home, James found himself lingering outside the Matthews apartment building. Sarah had invited him up for coffee, a first, saying there was something she wanted to discuss. The lobby was clean but worn, the elevator creaking ominously as it carried him to the 4th floor. Sarah answered his knock dressed in jeans and a faded t-shirt rather than her usual scrubs, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. Without the harried expression she typically wore during drop-offs and pickups, James was struck by how young she appeared, how the wariness in her eyes was balanced by a natural warmth. "Thank you for coming up," she said, ushering him inside. "It's not much, but it's home." The apartment was small but meticulously kept. What it lacked in space and luxury, it made up for in thoughtful touches. Framed drawings by Ethan lined the walls, potted plants occupied every available surface, and mismatched cushions in bright colors softened a worn sofa. "It's lovely," James said, meaning it. Despite its modest size, the apartment felt more like a home than his expansive penthouse ever had. Sarah gestured toward the kitchen table. "Coffee? I'm afraid I only have instant." "That would be perfect," James said, taking a seat. From a nearby room, he could hear the muffled sounds of Ethan talking on the phone, presumably to a friend. As Sarah busied herself with the kettle, James noticed a stack of bills on the counter, several marked with red past-due stamps. She caught his glance and quickly shuffled the papers into a drawer. "Ethan's teacher called me today," she said, changing the subject as she set a steaming mug before him. "She said he's shown remarkable improvement these past few weeks, more engaged, turning in assignments on time, participating in class discussions." James wrapped his hands around the mug. "That's excellent news." "Yes," Sarah agreed, sitting across from him. She also mentioned that Ethan told the class about his work on the community center, about you. There was something in her tone that James couldn't quite read. "I hope that's all right." Sarah studied him for a moment. "He called you his mentor, said you were teaching him how buildings could change people's lives." James felt a surge of unexpected emotion. "He gives me too much credit." "Does he?" Sarah leaned forward. "Mr. Harrington, James, I need to understand what's happening here. Ethan has never connected with an adult man like this, not since his father left." The implication hung in the air between them. James chose his next words carefully. "I enjoy Ethan's company. He's bright, creative, and sees the world in ways that most adults have forgotten how to see. But I have no intention of overstepping." "If my involvement in his life makes you uncomfortable—" "It doesn't," Sarah interrupted. "That's what concerns me." James raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to elaborate. "It should make me uncomfortable," she continued. "You're a virtual stranger, a billionaire who suddenly takes an interest in my son after he returns your wallet. That should set off every alarm bell I have." She sighed. "But instead, I find myself grateful. Grateful that he has someone to talk to about things I don't understand, someone who exposes him to possibilities I could never show him." "You sell yourself short," James said. "Ethan is who he is because of you, not me." Sarah smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "That's kind of you to say. But the reality is there are doors I can't open for him, no matter how hard I work or how much I love him." James felt the weight of her words, understanding for perhaps the first time the depth of her struggle, not just to provide materially for her son, but to give him access to a world beyond their limited circumstances. "Sarah," he said, using her first name deliberately, "Ethan has remarkable potential. All I'm doing is providing one opportunity. You've given him everything else he needs to succeed: character, work ethic, compassion." She looked away, blinking rapidly. "His father used to draw with him," she said after a moment. "Before he decided we weren't enough for him, that's where Ethan's talent comes from." The revelation shifted something in James's understanding. "And now Ethan draws with me." Sarah nodded. "Now he draws with you, and talks about you constantly, and comes home excited about ideas and possibilities instead of dwelling on what we don't have." She met his gaze directly. It scares me, James. What happens when this project ends? The question caught him off guard, though he realized it shouldn't have. The community center wouldn't take forever to design. Their arrangement had never been intended as permanent. I don't know, he admitted, but I'm not going to just disappear from his life. That's what my ex-husband said, Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Before he did exactly that. Before James could respond, Ethan bounded into the kitchen, stopping short when he noticed the serious expressions on their faces. "Everything okay?" he asked, glancing between them. Sarah's demeanor transformed instantly, a smile replacing her troubled expression. "Everything's fine, sweetheart. Mr. Harrington was just about to leave." James understood the dismissal for what it was. Not rejection, but a mother's protective instinct asserting itself. He stood, thanking Sarah for the coffee. As he left the apartment, Sarah's question echoed in his mind. What would happen when the project ended? For the first time, James realized that whatever this connection with Ethan had become, he wasn't prepared to let it go. Not now, perhaps not ever. And that realization terrified him almost as much as it seemed to terrify Sarah. November arrived with biting winds and early darkness. Construction on the community center had begun, transforming the abandoned warehouse into a living embodiment of Ethan's sketches. James found himself visiting the site almost daily, watching as steel beams rose and walls took shape, each element carefully aligned with the vision a 12-year-old boy had committed to paper. The project team had been skeptical at first, taking design cues from a child seemed indulgent at best, irresponsible at worst. But when James presented Ethan's concepts, explaining the reasoning behind each element, resistance gave way to reluctant admiration. By the time the foundation was poured, even the head architect had become an advocate, praising the refreshing perspective Ethan brought to the project. On a particularly cold Tuesday afternoon, James received an unexpected call from Sarah. "I hate to ask this," she began, her voice strained, "but is there any chance Ethan could skip today's session? He's running a fever, and I can't get away from my shift to pick him up from school." "Of course," James said immediately. "Is there someone who can stay with him?" Sarah sighed. "Our usual neighbor is away, and the after-school program won't take him if he's sick. I'm trying to find someone, but I could pick him up," James offered before he could consider the implications. "I could take him home, stay with him until you're done." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that James thought they might have been disconnected. "Sarah, are you there?" "Yes," she said finally. That's very generous, but I couldn't impose." "It's not an imposition," James insisted, already reaching for his coat. "I can reschedule my meetings. It's no trouble." Another pause, then, "You're sure?" "Absolutely. Text me the school address and any instructions. Does he need medication? Food?" As Sarah provided details, James felt a strange buzz of nervous energy. He had never been responsible for a sick child before. What if Ethan's condition worsened? What if he needed medical attention? Then again, it was just a fever, not a critical emergency, and Sarah trusted him enough to even consider his offer. An hour later, James stood in the administration office of Woodside Middle School, feeling decidedly out of place in his tailored suit among the institutional gray walls and linoleum floors. The secretary eyed him suspiciously as he explained who he was and why he was there. "You're not on Mrs. Matthews's approved pickup list," she said firmly. "She called me directly," James explained. "It was a last-minute arrangement. You can call her at the hospital to confirm." The woman narrowed her eyes, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "I'll need to see identification and speak with Mrs. Matthews personally." By the time the verification process was complete, Ethan had been brought to the office, his normally vibrant demeanor subdued by illness. His face brightened slightly when he saw James. "You're really here," he said, voice scratchy. "I thought Mom was joking." "Your mother doesn't strike me as the joking type," James replied with a smile, "especially about your well-being." The drive to the Matthews apartment was quiet, Ethan dozing against the window. James found himself checking the rearview mirror frequently, concerned by the boy's flushed cheeks and labored breathing. Parental worry, he realized with a start. This is what parents feel. At the apartment, James helped Ethan change into pajamas and settle on the couch, following Sarah's texted instructions to the letter. Fever medication administered, fluids encouraged, light blanket provided. "You don't have to stay," Ethan mumbled as James placed a cool washcloth on his forehead. "I'm used to being alone when I'm sick." The statement, so matter-of-fact, struck James like a physical blow. "Being alone when you're unwell is overrated," he said, keeping his tone light. "I've tried it. 0 stars, would not recommend." A smile flickered across Ethan's face before his eyes drifted closed again. James settled into an armchair, opening his laptop to catch up on emails while Ethan slept. But instead of focusing on work, he found his gaze repeatedly drawn to the boy on the couch, to the framed drawings on the walls, to the small details that made up Ethan's life. A well-worn sketchbook peeked out from beneath a school textbook. A model rocket kit sat half-assembled on a side table. A faded photograph of a younger Ethan with Sarah and a man James presumed was the absent father stood on a bookshelf, the three of them smiling against a backdrop of autumn trees. James rose quietly and examined the photo more closely. The resemblance between Ethan and his father was striking. Same unruly dark hair, same angular face. But Ethan had Sarah's eyes, wide and expressive, currently closed in feverish sleep just a few feet away. As the afternoon wore on, James made soup from a can he found in the pantry, coaxed Ethan to eat a few spoonfuls, and monitored his temperature as Sarah had instructed. The fever seemed to be subsiding, but Ethan remained listless, drifting in and out of sleep. During one of his wakeful periods, Ethan asked unexpectedly, "Do you miss your wife?" James, caught off guard by the directness of the question, hesitated before answering truthfully, "Every day." "What was she like?" James settled back into the armchair, memories washing over him. "Her name was Claire. She was vibrant, always laughing, always seeing the best in situations and people. She was an architectural historian. She loved old buildings, believed they held stories that needed preserving." "Is that why you build things?" Ethan asked, his voice clearer than it had been all day. "Because of her?" The question penetrated deeper than James expected. "I hadn't thought of it that way, but maybe. She certainly influenced how I see the built environment." Ethan nodded, as though this confirmed something he had suspected. "I think she would like the community center." "I think so too," James said softly, surprised by how much the boy's approval of this hypothetical connection to Claire meant to him. They fell into a comfortable silence, broken only when Ethan spoke again, his voice heavy with approaching sleep. "My dad didn't like my drawings. He said art wasn't practical. That's why I wanted to be a scientist instead." James felt a surge of anger toward this unknown man who had dismissed his son's passion so carelessly. "Well, I'm not a scientist," he said, "but it seems to me that changing how people experience their environment is extremely practical, and art is one way to do that." Ethan's eyes were closed now, but a small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "That's what I think too," he murmured before drifting off again. Sarah returned just after 7, looking exhausted but relieved to find Ethan's fever reduced and the boy sleeping peacefully. She sank onto the couch beside her son, brushing hair from his forehead with gentle fingers. "Thank you," she said quietly. "This was above and beyond." James shook his head. It was no hardship. He's a remarkable kid. Sarah studied him for a long moment. You're different than I expected. How so? When Ethan first told me about you, I imagined someone colder, more concerned with image than substance. James smiled ruefully. That was probably an accurate assessment not too long ago. She returned his smile, the gesture transforming her tired face. Something changed. James glanced at Ethan, sleeping peacefully beneath his mother's watchful gaze. Something, he agreed. As he prepared to leave, gathering his coat and briefcase, Sarah walked him to the door. James, she said, her voice lowered to avoid disturbing Ethan. Would you like to join us for Thanksgiving next week? It's nothing fancy, just turkey sandwiches and store-bought pie, but Ethan would love it and... She hesitated. It might be nice not to be alone on the holiday. The invitation caught James completely by surprise. He had spent the last 5 Thanksgivings working, deliberately avoiding the empty traditions that felt hollow without Claire. The thought of sharing a simple meal with Ethan and Sarah was both appealing and terrifying in its normalcy. I'd like that, he said before he could overthink it. Thank you. As he drove home through the darkened city streets, James realized something profound had shifted. In caring for Ethan today, in being invited into their modest holiday celebration, he had been offered entry into something he had been avoiding since Claire's death, not just human connection, but family. The realization should have sent him retreating back into the safe isolation he had cultivated for years. Instead, he found himself looking forward to turkey sandwiches and store-bought pie with an anticipation he hadn't felt in longer than he could remember. Thanksgiving arrived with a dusting of early snow, transforming New York into a glittering postcard scene. James stood outside the Matthews Building, a bottle of sparkling cider in one hand, a bag from a high-end bakery in the other. He had debated bringing wine but remembered Sarah's mention of store-bought pie and decided against anything that might make her feel he was upgrading their simple celebration. He had almost canceled twice. The first time, 3 days after accepting the invitation, panic had set in. What was he doing inserting himself into this family's holiday? The second time that morning had been worse. Memories of Thanksgivings with Claire, overwhelming him as he stood in his closet trying to decide what to wear to a casual family dinner, something he hadn't attended in years. But he was here now, pressing the buzzer for apartment 4B, telling himself this was just another social obligation, no different from the charity galas and business dinners that filled his calendar, except it was entirely different, and they both knew it. Ethan answered the door, his face lighting up when he saw James. "You came." The genuine surprise in his voice suggested he hadn't been entirely certain James would follow through. "I said I would," James replied, stepping inside and handing the boy the bakery bag. "Pie reinforcements, as requested." "Mom," Ethan called, already peering into the bag. "Mr. Harrington brought fancy pies." Sarah emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She wore jeans and a simple green sweater, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. The apartment smelled of roasting turkey, not sandwiches after all, James noted, and something sweet and spicy. "Sorry about the pie excitement," she said with a smile. "We usually get ours from the grocery store." "Nothing wrong with that," James said quickly. "I just happened to be near this bakery and—" "You don't need to explain," Sarah interrupted gently. "Thank you for bringing them. And for coming." The awkwardness James had anticipated did materialize, but in unexpected ways. It wasn't the modest setting or the simple meal that created tension, but rather his own inability to simply be without analyzing every interaction, every glance. He found himself hyper-aware of how he held his fork, how often he complimented the food, whether his questions about their family traditions came across as genuine interest or condescension. It was Ethan who finally broke through his self-consciousness, drawing him into an animated debate about whether the community center should include a rooftop garden. "It would be amazing," Ethan insisted, sketching rapidly on a paper napkin. "People could grow food, learn about plants, have a quiet place above the street noise." "The structural reinforcement would be costly," James countered, falling into the easy back and forth they had established during their work sessions. "And there are liability concerns." "But think about the kids who live in apartments with no yards," Ethan persisted. "Where are they supposed to learn about growing things?" Sarah watched their exchange with a thoughtful expression. When there was a lull in the debate, she asked, "How is the construction coming along?" "Ethan says they've started on the interior walls." "Ahead of schedule, actually," James confirmed. "The basic structure is complete, and the roof is on before the heavy winter weather. We're hoping for a spring opening." "Just in time for summer programs," Ethan added enthusiastically. "Mr. Harrington said I could help design activities for the art room." Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly. "That sounds like a longer-term involvement." The question beneath her observation wasn't lost on James. Their arrangement had been for Ethan to work on initial design concepts, which were now largely complete. Yet here they were, discussing future plans as if their connection would continue indefinitely. "If Ethan is interested," James said carefully, "there will always be aspects of the project where his input would be valuable." Sarah nodded slowly, neither agreeing nor objecting. James sensed the conversation teetering on the edge of something deeper, but Ethan interrupted by bringing out the pies, and the moment passed. After dinner, Ethan insisted on showing James his room, a space so small that James's walk-in closet at home could have contained it twice over. Yet what the room lacked in size, it made up for in personality. Every surface was covered with drawings, model rockets, and books arranged by subject rather than author. A small desk occupied the window corner where a sketchbook lay open to a half-finished drawing of what appeared to be the community center's main entrance. "This is where I do my best thinking," Ethan said proudly. "Mom says I'm lucky to have my own room at all in New York, so I try to make the most of it." James nodded, taking in the carefully curated space. "It's perfect." When they returned to the living room, they found Sarah curled in the corner of the sofa, a cup of coffee cradled in her hands, her expression distant. She blinked when they entered, offering a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Everything okay?" James asked. "Just tired," she said. "Long week at the hospital." Ethan glanced between them. "I'm going to work on that rooftop garden design," he announced, clearly sensing adult conversation brewing. "So you can have some boring grown-up talk." Once he had disappeared back into his room, Sarah's smile faded. "He used to do that when his father and I needed to discuss bills or scheduling conflicts. Developed a sixth sense for tension." James sat across from her. "Smart kid." "Too smart sometimes." She took a sip of her coffee. "James, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Her serious tone set off alarm bells. "Of course." "What do you want from this relationship with Ethan?" The directness of the question caught him off guard. "I'm not sure I understand." "Yes, you do," Sarah said, her voice gentle but firm. "This started as a business arrangement. Ethan would do some drawings, you'd pay him for his time, but it's become something else, hasn't it? The way he talks about you, the time you spend together, how you showed up to care for him when he was sick. These aren't the actions of an employer." James felt suddenly defensive. "I've never behaved inappropriately." "That's not what I'm suggesting," Sarah interrupted. "I know you care about him. That's the problem." "Caring is a problem. It is when there's no framework for it." She set her cup down. Ethan's father made a lot of promises. He was going to stay in touch, visit regularly, be part of Ethan's life even after he moved away. None of that happened. And I had to pick up the pieces when Ethan realized his father wasn't coming back. James felt a knot forming in his stomach. I'm not Ethan's father. No, Sarah agreed. But you're becoming something to him. A mentor, a role model, maybe something more. And I need to know if you're prepared for what that means, because I'm not sure you are. The challenge in her words was unmistakable. James had been so focused on what Ethan and Sarah had come to mean to him that he hadn't fully considered his responsibilities to them, especially to a boy who had already experienced profound abandonment. I don't have an easy answer, he admitted. When Ethan returned my wallet with that drawing, something changed for me. I've lived the last 5 years in a fog, going through the motions. Being around Ethan and you has made me feel connected again. He paused, searching for the right words. I don't want to make promises I can't keep, but I'm not looking for a convenient exit strategy either. Sarah studied him, her expression softening slightly. That's a better answer than I expected. What would make you feel secure in this, whatever this is? James asked. Consistency, she said without hesitation. Not grand gestures or expensive opportunities, but showing up reliably, being the same person tomorrow that you are today. The simplicity of her request humbled him. She wasn't asking for financial support or connections to elite schools or any of the obvious advantages his wealth could provide. She was asking for something more fundamental: trustworthiness. I can do that, he said. Sarah nodded, but her eyes remained cautious. We'll see. Later, as James prepared to leave, Ethan presented him with a small, clumsily wrapped package. It's a Thanksgiving present, he explained. I know that's not really a thing, but I wanted you to have it. James unwrapped it carefully, revealing a framed drawing, not of the community center or futuristic spacecraft, but of 3 figures standing together outside a building that looked remarkably like the Matthews apartment. The figures were clearly Ethan, Sarah, and James, rendered with the boy's distinctive artistic touch. It's us, Ethan said unnecessarily. I made it after you took care of me when I was sick. James stared at the drawing, emotion tightening his throat. It was simple yet profound. A child's vision of connection, of belonging, of family, the kind of vision an adult might dismiss as impractical, given the complexities of their situation. But looking at Sarah's face, seeing her guarded expression softening as she observed his reaction, James allowed himself to wonder if perhaps children sometimes saw possibilities more clearly than adults. Thank you, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. I'll treasure this. As he drove home through the snowy streets, the drawing carefully placed on the passenger seat beside him, James realized that the day had changed something fundamental. The Matthews were no longer a project, a charity case, or even just people he cared about. They were becoming his family, and that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. December arrived with biting winds and holiday decorations appearing throughout the city. The community center project continued at a steady pace, with Ethan's designs being integrated into the actual construction. James had made good on his promise of consistency, establishing a rhythm of predictable involvement in Ethan's life that went beyond their twice-weekly work sessions. He attended a science fair where Ethan's model of a sustainable lunar habitat earned honorable mention. He helped the boy study for a history test when Sarah was stuck working a double shift. Small moments of normalcy that had once seemed impossible in James's carefully isolated life. The drawing Ethan had given him on Thanksgiving now hung in James's home office, the only personal item in a space otherwise defined by sleek minimalism. He found himself looking at it often, particularly during late-night conference calls with international partners, the 3 simple figures reminding him there was life beyond spreadsheets and stock projections. Mr. Harrington? Melissa's voice interrupted his thoughts one afternoon as he reviewed the community center's updated budget. "There's a Sarah Matthews online too. She says it's important." James felt a jolt of concern. Sarah rarely called his office. "Put her through." "James," Sarah's voice came through, tight with stress. "I hate to bother you at work, but I've got a situation. The hospital called me in for an emergency shift. Ethan's after-school program was canceled because of a water main break, and I can't reach any of our neighbors." "Where is he now?" James asked, already reaching for his coat. "Still at school in the office. The principal can't let him stay much longer. They're closing early too because of the water issue." "I'll pick him up," James said without hesitation. "Text me the details." Within 30 minutes, James had cleared his schedule and arrived at Woodside Middle School. This time, unlike his first visit when Ethan was sick, the secretary barely glanced at his ID before calling Ethan from the waiting area. It was a small shift, but significant. James was now a recognized part of Ethan's life, someone expected rather than suspect. "Sorry about this," Ethan said as they walked to James's car. "Mom tried everyone else first." James smiled. "I'm glad she called me. Besides, I could use a break from budget reports." Instead of driving directly to the Matthews apartment, James made an impulsive decision. "Have you ever seen the holiday window displays at the major department stores?" Ethan shook his head. "Mom says they're too crowded this time of year." "She's not wrong," James admitted, "but they're worth seeing at least once. What do you say we brave the crowds?" The afternoon turned into an unexpected adventure, weaving through throngs of tourists who admire elaborate window scenes depicting winter wonderlands and fantastical versions of Santa's workshop. James bought them hot chocolate from a street vendor, and they critiqued each display's design elements with the same seriousness they applied to the community center plans. "This one has better lighting," Ethan declared, pointing to a particularly elaborate scene featuring animatronic elves. "But the scale is all wrong. No workshop that small could produce gifts for all the children in the world." James laughed. "A very practical observation." As the early winter darkness descended, they found themselves near Rockefeller Center, where the massive Christmas tree towered above the ice skating rink below. "Do you celebrate Christmas?" James asked, realizing he didn't know the Matthews holiday traditions. "Yeah, but nothing fancy," Ethan said, his breath fogging in the cold air. "Mom tries to get the day off, but sometimes she has to work. Last year she had the morning shift, so we opened presents when she got home. It was still nice." The matter-of-fact way Ethan described his modest Christmas struck James anew with the disparity between their circumstances. Here was a child who considered having his mother home for part of Christmas Day nice, while James's own childhood had featured lavish celebrations with mountains of expensive gifts, extended family gatherings, and never a thought that it could be otherwise. "What about you?" Ethan asked. "Do you have big fancy Christmas parties and stuff?" James shook his head. "Not anymore. I used to when Claire was alive. She loved the holidays, decorating the tree, baking cookies, all of it. After she died, I just stopped." Ethan looked up at him thoughtfully. "That's sad. I bet she wouldn't want you to stop celebrating." "Probably not," James agreed. "Maybe it's time to start again." The idea took root as they drove back to the Matthews apartment, where James intended to stay with Ethan until Sarah returned. By the time they arrived, a plan had begun to form in his mind. Not a grand party or excessive display of wealth, but something meaningful that might bring joy to both Ethan and Sarah. James helped Ethan with homework and then ordered takeout for dinner. As they ate, he broached the subject carefully. "I was thinking," he began, "would you and your mother have any interest in coming to my place for Christmas Eve? Nothing elaborate, just dinner and maybe some holiday movies." Ethan's face lit up. "Really? At your apartment? The penthouse? Yes, James smiled at his enthusiasm. If your mother agrees, of course. She has Christmas Eve off this year, Ethan said quickly. She traded shifts with another nurse so we could have the whole night together. Perfect, James said. I'll speak with her about it when she gets home. When Sarah arrived just after 9, exhausted from her emergency shift but grateful to find Ethan fed and homework complete, James extended the invitation. To his surprise, she agreed readily. We'd love to, she said, sinking onto the couch. It's kind of you to offer. As the holiday approached, James found himself experiencing an unexpected sense of anticipation. He hired a service to clean his penthouse, which had accumulated a layer of neglect despite his housekeeper's regular visits. He ordered a Christmas tree, the first to grace his home in 5 years, and spent an evening decorating it with ornaments that had been stored away since Claire's death. Each bauble and light strand carried memories, but the pain of unpacking them was tempered by the thought of Ethan and Sarah's visit. 3 days before Christmas Eve, James received a call that threatened to derail his carefully laid plans. "Mr. Harrington," said the contractor overseeing the community center construction, "we've hit a serious issue. The city inspector found code violations in the electrical system. If we don't address them immediately, we'll lose our occupancy permit, and the whole timeline will be delayed by months." "What do we need to do?" James asked, already dreading the answer. "We need to open up some walls, rewire several areas. The materials aren't the problem, it's the timing. With the holidays, most of the crew is gone. We'd need someone to oversee the work, approve changes on the spot to keep things moving." "When?" James asked, though he already knew the answer would conflict with his holiday plans. "Starting tomorrow, through Christmas, possibly longer." James closed his eyes, weighing his options. The community center was important, not just to him, but to Ethan, who had poured his heart into the design. Delaying the project would disappoint the boy deeply, not to mention the many families counting on the center's programs. But Christmas Eve with Ethan and Sarah, the first real holiday celebration he had planned since Claire's death, felt equally significant. "Let me make some calls," James said finally. "I'll get back to you within the hour." When he hung up, James stared at the festive tree in his living room, its lights reflecting off the floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the city below. Then his gaze shifted to Ethan's drawing, the 3 simple figures standing together like a family. He had promised Sarah consistency, being reliable, showing up. These weren't just words. They were a commitment he had made to both her and Ethan. A commitment that meant sometimes choosing the personal over the professional, no matter how urgent the latter might seem. With sudden clarity, James made his decision. Reaching for his phone, he called his project director. "David, we have a situation at the community center that needs immediate attention," he began. "I need you to handle it personally." As he outlined the problem and the solution, James felt a curious sense of relief. 5 years ago, even 5 months ago, he would have canceled his personal plans without a second thought, prioritizing the project above all else. Now, standing beside the Christmas tree he had decorated for a 12-year-old boy and his mother, James realized how profoundly his priorities had shifted. The community center would be completed, perhaps with a slight delay. But Christmas Eve would happen exactly as planned, because some promises once made changed everything. Christmas Eve arrived with a gentle snowfall that blanketed the city in pristine white. James spent the morning in a state of nervous anticipation, checking and rechecking the dinner arrangements, adjusting ornaments on the tree, and second-guessing his gift selections. He had been careful with the presents, thoughtful rather than extravagant, mindful of Sarah's pride and wariness of anything that might seem like charity. For Ethan, he had selected a professional-grade drawing tablet, one that would allow the boy to explore digital art without replacing his beloved sketchbooks. For Sarah, after much deliberation, he had chosen a vintage medical textbook from the 1920s, beautifully illustrated and bound in leather, something that acknowledged her profession while appealing to her appreciation for history, a passion she had mentioned during their Thanksgiving conversation. As evening approached, James found himself standing at his window, watching snowflakes dance against the darkening sky. 5 years ago, this penthouse had been filled with people, colleagues, friends, Claire's family, all gathered for the holiday party she insisted on hosting each year. The laughter, the music, the warmth of human connection had vanished with her, replaced by a silence he had told himself was preferable. Until now. Until a boy with a stolen wallet and a remarkable drawing had shown him there might be another way to live. The intercom buzzed, announcing his guest's arrival. James took a deep breath, straightening his sweater, casual but expensive, a concession to the occasion without being overly formal. When the elevator doors opened directly into his foyer, he was greeted by Ethan's wide-eyed stare. "Whoa," the boy breathed, taking in the space, the soaring ceilings, the panoramic views. "This is like something from a movie." Sarah appeared behind him, her expression more measured but similarly impressed. She had dressed up for the occasion, wearing a simple green dress that brought out the warmth in her eyes, her dark hair falling in loose waves around her shoulders. James was struck again by how young she appeared when not exhausted from a hospital shift, how the genuine smile she offered transformed her face. "Welcome," he said, stepping aside to let them enter. "Merry Christmas." Ethan moved immediately to the windows, pressing his hands against the glass as he gazed at the city below. "You can see everything from here, the park, the buildings, even the ice rink." Sarah joined James in the entryway, handing him a small, carefully wrapped package. "It's not much," she said quietly, but Ethan insisted we couldn't come empty-handed. "You didn't need to bring anything," James protested, though he was touched by the gesture. "That's what I told him, but he's stubborn." Sarah glanced around, taking in the tasteful holiday decorations, the massive tree with its twinkling lights. "This is beautiful, James. Thank you for including us." The genuine gratitude in her voice warmed him. "I'm glad you could come." Dinner was catered. James had briefly considered cooking before acknowledging his limitations in the kitchen, but he had set the table himself, something he couldn't remember doing since Claire was alive. The conversation flowed more easily than he had anticipated, Ethan's enthusiasm bridging any awkward moments, his endless questions about the buildings visible from the windows providing natural talking points. As they finished dessert, Ethan's expression grew suddenly serious. "I have a question," he said, glancing between James and his mother. "Are we like a family now?" The directness of the question created an immediate stillness at the table. Sarah's fork paused midway to her mouth, and James felt his breath catch. "I mean," Ethan continued, seemingly oblivious to the effect of his words, "we spend holidays together, and Mr. Harrington comes to my science fairs and he helps me with homework sometimes. That's what families do, right?" Sarah recovered first, setting down her fork carefully. "Ethan, Mr. Harrington is a good friend who's been very kind to us, but—" "It's a fair question," James interrupted gently. He met Ethan's gaze directly. "Families come in many forms, Ethan. Some are related by blood, others by choice. What matters isn't the label but the caring, the commitment to being there for each other." "So we could be a family, even if we're not related?" Ethan pressed. James glanced at Sarah, uncertain how far he should go in addressing this. Her expression was guarded, but not hostile. Taking a chance, he continued. "In some ways, perhaps we are becoming a kind of family," he said carefully, "but that's something your mother and I would need to discuss more fully." Ethan seemed satisfied with this answer, returning to his dessert with renewed enthusiasm. But the question lingered in the air between the adults, carrying implications neither was prepared to address directly. After dinner, they moved to the living room, where presents waited beneath the tree. Ethan's excitement was infectious as he handed out the gifts he and Sarah had brought, hand-drawn cards for James, each depicting a different architectural marvel, with small figures of the three of them standing before it. "I made 12, Ethan explained, as James examined them with genuine admiration. "One for each month. Mom helped me get them printed on nice paper." "These are remarkable," James said, deeply touched by the thought and effort behind the gift. "Thank you both." When Ethan opened the drawing tablet, his reaction was everything James had hoped for. Wide-eyed disbelief followed by a stream of excited questions about its capabilities. Sarah's response to the vintage medical text was more subdued but equally gratifying, her fingers tracing the detailed illustrations with reverence. "This is thoughtful," she said softly. "How did you know I collect old medical books?" "Ethan mentioned it," James admitted. "He said you have a shelf of them that no one is allowed to touch." She smiled, a hint of color rising in her cheeks. "My one indulgence. This will be the centerpiece of my small collection. Thank you." As the evening progressed, they watched a holiday movie. Ethan sprawled on the floor surrounded by drawing supplies, occasionally holding up sketches for their approval. The scene was so domestic, so normal, that James found himself periodically struck by its improbability. 5 years of deliberate isolation, of armoring himself against precisely this kind of emotional vulnerability, undone by a wallet, a drawing, and the simple phrase, "Dad and me." Later, as the movie ended and Ethan's eyelids grew heavy, Sarah announced it was time to leave. The boy protested sleepily, but gathered his gifts without too much complaint. "I'll drive you home," James offered, reaching for his keys. "That's not necessary," Sarah began, but Ethan interrupted. "Can we see the community center on the way? I want to check if they fixed the electrical stuff." James hesitated. He had been deliberately vague about the center's issues, not wanting to worry Ethan. "It's probably closed for the holiday, but we could drive by." The detour added 20 minutes to their journey, the construction site dark and silent beneath the falling snow. But as James slowed the car, they could see the progress even from outside, the walls complete, windows installed, the building taking shape exactly as Ethan had envisioned it. "It's really happening," Ethan whispered, pressing his face against the car window. "My design is becoming real." "Of course it is," James said. "You created something special, Ethan. Something that will help many people for years to come." As they pulled away, James caught Sarah watching him in the rearview mirror, her expression thoughtful. When they reached the apartment building, Ethan yawned his way through goodbyes, clutching his new tablet as he headed inside. Sarah lingered, her hand on the car door. "Thank you for tonight," she said. "It meant a lot to him, to both of us." "I enjoyed it more than I can express," James replied truthfully. She seemed to be weighing something, hesitating between leaving and speaking. Finally, she took a deep breath. "About what Ethan asked at dinner, about whether we're becoming a family." James felt his heart rate accelerate. "Yes? I'm not ready to answer that question," she said carefully, "but I'm not afraid of it anymore either." Before James could respond, she leaned in unexpectedly and kissed his cheek, a brief, warm contact that left him momentarily speechless. Then she was gone, hurrying through the falling snow to join her son inside. James sat in his car for several minutes, watching the windows of their apartment light up one by one. For the first time since losing Claire, he felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Not the ache of grief or the emptiness of loss, but something lighter, something that felt remarkably like hope. Whatever they were becoming, Friends, extended family, or something yet unnamed, James knew with sudden clarity that his life would never return to the carefully isolated existence he had constructed after Claire's death. And for that, he was profoundly grateful. Spring arrived in New York with a burst of renewal, trees in Central Park unfurling tender leaves, flower vendors reappearing on street corners, and the community center in Queens approaching completion. The months following Christmas had brought subtle but significant changes to the evolving relationship between James, Ethan, and Sarah. James had become a fixture in their lives, attending Ethan's school events, joining them for dinner at least once a week, even accompanying Sarah to a hospital fundraiser where she was being honored for her work in pediatric care. The twice-weekly work sessions with Ethan had continued, though their focus had shifted from design to planning the center's grand opening. For James, the gradual integration into their lives had been both terrifying and exhilarating. There were moments when the fear of loss, the same paralyzing dread that had kept him isolated for years, threatened to overwhelm him. What if he failed them? What if they disappeared as suddenly as Claire had? But increasingly, those fears were overshadowed by something stronger, the simple joy of belonging. Sarah, too, had undergone a transformation. The wariness that had characterized her early interactions with James had softened into something more trusting. She no longer double-checked his motives or questioned his presence in their lives. Instead, there were small, telling gestures, calling him first when she needed help with Ethan, saving articles she thought might interest him, allowing her hand to linger on his when passing a coffee cup. And Ethan flourished in the stability of this new arrangement. His grades improved, his artistic talent continued to develop, and the shadow of abandonment that had followed him since his father's departure seemed to lift. He had taken to calling James Mr. H instead of the more formal Mr. Harrington, a small change that somehow bridged the gap between respectful distance and familial affection. The community center was scheduled to open on the first Saturday in April. As the date approached, James found himself increasingly anxious about the event. It wasn't just another project anymore. It was a physical manifestation of his connection to Ethan, a tangible result of the boy's vision and creativity. Its success or failure felt deeply personal in a way no previous business venture ever had. The night before the opening, James invited Sarah and Ethan to his penthouse for dinner. As they sat together at the dining table, reviewing the next day's schedule, Ethan suddenly asked, "Will my drawing be there?" "Which one?" James inquired, though he had a feeling he knew exactly which drawing Ethan meant. "The one I gave you with your wallet, the Dad and Me one." Sarah glanced at James, their eyes meeting in silent communication. They had never directly addressed the implication of that drawing, the suggestion of a father-son relationship that neither had explicitly acknowledged. "Actually," James said, reaching for a folder on the sideboard, "I had something special done with it." He handed Ethan a mock-up of a plaque. "This will be installed in the main entrance hall." Ethan's eyes widened as he read the text. "The Matthews Harrington Community Center, founded on the belief that every person deserves a space to grow, create, and belong, inspired by a drawing from Ethan Matthews, age 12. Beneath the text was a professionally rendered version of Ethan's original drawing, the father and child standing together, subtly incorporated into the center's logo. You named it after us." Ethan's voice was barely above a whisper. "After all of us," James confirmed, "if that's okay with you and your mother." Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "It's more than okay," she said softly. "It's perfect." The next morning dawned clear and bright, ideal weather for the center's opening celebration. James arrived early, surveying the completed building with a critical eye. Every element reflected Ethan's original vision, from the rooftop garden, which James had ultimately agreed to despite the added costs, to the open, welcoming lobby designed to make visitors of all ages feel immediately at home. As city officials, community leaders, and curious neighbors began to arrive, James felt an unfamiliar nervousness. This wasn't like the countless corporate openings he had presided over, where success was measured in stock valuations and media coverage. Today's success would be gauged by the smiles on children's faces, by whether families felt genuinely welcomed in the space. Sarah and Ethan arrived just before the ceremony was set to begin. Ethan wore a button-down shirt and tie, clearly new, slightly too large for his still-growing frame. Sarah had dressed up as well, wearing a simple blue dress that complemented her eyes. They looked, James thought with sudden clarity, like family. The ribbon-cutting proceeded with the usual speeches from politicians eager to associate themselves with the project. James kept his own remarks brief, focusing on the community's needs and how the center aimed to address them. But as the formalities concluded and guests began touring the facility, he found himself drawn to the entrance hall where the new plaque had been installed. He stood before it, studying the image and text that officially linked his name with the Matthews family. The gesture had been impulsive, or perhaps not so impulsive at all, but rather the natural culmination of feelings that had been developing for months. "It looks good," Sarah said, appearing beside him, "though I'm still not sure we deserve equal billing with the man who paid for everything." "The money was the easy part," James replied. "The vision, the heart of this place, that came from Ethan, and from you, indirectly. The way you've raised him to see possibilities where others might only see problems." Sarah smiled, her shoulder brushing against his, another of those small, deliberate points of contact that had become more frequent between them. "He's a special kid. He takes after his mother." A comfortable silence settled between them as they watched Ethan enthusiastically leading a group of neighborhood children through the art room, pointing out features he had specifically designed with young artists in mind. "Do you ever wonder," Sarah said after a moment, "what would have happened if he hadn't taken your wallet that night?" James considered the question. "I'd still be alone in my penthouse, working too much and living too little, and you two would still be struggling along without the support you deserve." "We were managing," Sarah said, a hint of her old defensiveness surfacing. "You were," James agreed quickly. "But everyone needs connection, Sarah, even stubborn, independent single mothers and emotionally withdrawn billionaires." She laughed, the sound brightening the already sunlit hall. "Is that what we are?" "Among other things," James said carefully. "Although lately I've been thinking we might be something else as well." Sarah turned to face him fully, her expression serious but open. "And what might that be?" James glanced at the plaque, at their names joined together in bronze, at the stylized version of Ethan's drawing that had started everything. "I think Ethan had it right from the beginning. The dad and me drawing, it wasn't just wishful thinking. It was prophetic." "James," Sarah began, but he gently interrupted. "I'm not proposing anything specific. Not yet. I'm just acknowledging what's already happening, what has been happening since that rainy night when a boy returned a wallet and changed everything." Sarah's eyes searched his, looking for uncertainty or hesitation. Finding none, she nodded slowly. "We've come a long way from me suspecting you were up to no good, and from me thinking I could solve everything with money," James added. Their conversation was interrupted by Ethan bounding up to them, eyes bright with excitement. "Mr. H, Mom, you have to come see the science room. They set up everything exactly like I suggested, and there's even a space telescope for nighttime stargazing from the roof." James exchanged a glance with Sarah, both of them smiling at Ethan's enthusiasm. "Lead the way," James said, gesturing for the boy to go ahead. As they followed Ethan through the bustling center, James felt Sarah's hand slip into his, their fingers intertwining naturally, as if they had been doing this for years rather than months. The gesture was small but profound, an acknowledgement of whatever they were becoming, of the journey they had begun when a drawing marked "Dad and Me" had found its way back to him along with his stolen wallet. Outside the science room, Ethan turned back to them, beaming with pride at what his vision had created. Seeing James and Sarah's clasped hands, his smile grew even wider, but he said nothing, simply holding the door open for them to enter. Together, they stepped into the future they were building, not just the community center with its gleaming new facilities, but a shared life that none of them had expected to find. A life that had begun with a lost wallet, a child's drawing, and 3 simple words that had somehow predicted everything: Dad and Me.